The story begins with the narrator painting a picture of the family barn, not just as an old wooden structure, but as a symbol of history, tradition, and identity. Built nearly a century ago by the narrator's great-grandfather, the barn has stood proudly on the family's land through wars, storms, and changing generations. It isn't just a building, it's a monument to the family's hard work, sacrifice, and resilience. The narrator recalls how, as a child, they spent summers climbing the loft, hiding in the hay, and listening to stories from their grandfather about how the barn was built by hand, using lumber from the very trees that once grew on the property. Inside, the barn isn't just storage for tools or hay, it has become a vault of memories. Old farm equipment, a rusted but well-kept tractor, and faded photographs still hang on the walls. The smell of wood and earth brings a sense of nostalgia every time the narrator steps inside. Even the neighbors, some of whom have lived nearby for decades, see it as a landmark of the community. For many, it is a reminder of simpler times before HOAs and rigid rules took control of neighborhoods. The barn is also practical, not merely sentimental. The narrator uses it for storing farming tools, housing small livestock, and even hosting family gatherings. During community events, people gather in and around the barn for picnics and barbecues. Its wide red doors and weathered exterior may look old-fashioned, but they stand as proof that the barn is still strong, sturdy, and meaningful. However, this deep appreciation for the barn is not shared by everyone, especially the homeowners association. From the very beginning, the HOA has viewed the barn as out of place. Their excuse is that it does not fit the modern aesthetic they want to impose on the community. They dismiss its history and value, reducing it to nothing more than an old shed that they claim lowers property values. But for the narrator, this barn is more than wood and nails. It's the soul of the land. It's the last standing piece of heritage that connects the present to the past. Without it, the property feels incomplete, like tearing out a chapter from a family storybook. The narrator emphasizes that every board, every dent, and every scar on the barn tells a tale, whether it's from storms weathered or family celebrations held inside. This is why the narrator fights so hard to protect it. When they speak about the barn, their tone is filled with pride and love, as though describing a family member rather than a structure. It's a place that roots them to their ancestors, while also giving their children and future generations a physical connection to their lineage. Thus, the barn is introduced not as an object, but as a character in itself, a character full of history, memories, and meaning. Its importance sets the emotional foundation for the story, making the HOA's later actions not just a violation of property. After laying the emotional foundation of what the family barn means, the conflict begins when the homeowners association shifts its focus toward the narrator's property. At first, it starts subtly, small comments made at HOA meetings or in passing conversations with neighbors. The HOA members, especially the board president, begin labeling the barn an eyesore and a liability. They claim it doesn't fit the polished image of the neighborhood, where most houses are modern builds with neat, uniform yards. The HOA's complaints are framed as concern for community standards, but beneath the polite words, there's a sharp undertone of control. They begin sending official letters to the narrator, citing vague violations such as unsightly structures and non-conforming aesthetics. Each letter is more aggressive than the last, warning of fines and enforcement actions if the barn isn't removed or updated. The narrator, bewildered, responds by reminding the board that the barn predates the HOA itself by decades. It was on the land long before any of the houses or rules existed. In fact, the neighborhood was built around the family's property, not the other way around. But the HOA dismisses this fact, twisting the rules to claim that all visible structures must comply with their regulations, no matter the history. What makes it worse is how the HOA frames the barn to others. They spread the idea that the barn is dangerous, suggesting it's falling apart, a fire hazard, or even attracting pests like termites and rodents. None of this is true, but for some homeowners who don't know the full history, the rumors start to take root. The narrator can feel a shift, some neighbors begin looking at the barn with suspicion rather than admiration. Tensions rise further when the HOA president, a controlling figure often referred to as the Karen of the story, starts targeting the narrator directly. She insists at meetings that property values are at risk because of the barn, and pressures other board members to back her stance. The narrator, meanwhile, pushes back with evidence. Professional inspections prove the barn is structurally sound and safe. They even invite the HOA to visit and see for themselves, but the invitation is ignored. The back and forth escalates into a tug of war. The HOA continues to send threatening notices, piling up potential fines. The narrator continues to resist, refusing to let go of the family's heritage. What started as a disagreement now feels like a battle of principles, freedom of property versus the HOA's obsession with uniformity and control. The real breaking point comes when the HOA begins holding secret meetings without inviting the narrator, despite the fact that their property is the focus of discussion. Whispers of redevelopment plans start to surface, developers eyeing land for new projects, with the barn standing as the only obstacle. As the conflict with the homeowners association intensifies, the board realizes that simply calling the barn an eyesore isn't enough to justify extreme action. They need stronger arguments, something that sounds urgent and alarming enough to sway the community to their side. That's when the false claims begin. The HOA president and her close allies start weaving a narrative that the barn is not just unattractive, but unsafe. They claim it is structurally unstable, insisting that it could collapse at any moment, endangering children who play nearby. They go so far as to distribute flyers with exaggerated warnings about rotting beams and unsecured walls, none of which are true. These scare tactics begin to influence some homeowners who haven't actually seen the inside of the barn in years. The lies don't stop there. At board meetings, the HOA claims the barn is a health hazard. They accuse it of attracting termites, rodents, and even snakes, painting a picture of an infested and decaying structure. These allegations are not only false but insulting to the narrator, who has maintained the barn carefully for decades. Regular inspections and upkeep have kept it strong and clean, yet the HOA deliberately ignores the evidence, spinning a story to suit their agenda. To add more pressure, the HOA even claims that the barn violates fire safety codes. They say the old wood is a tinderbox that could ignite and spread flames to nearby homes. Again, this is a baseless accusation, as fire safety inspectors had cleared the property only a year earlier. But the HOA isn't interested in facts, they're interested in fear. The narrator fights back by presenting inspection reports, photographs, and testimony from professionals confirming the barn's safety. But every time, the HOA twists the story. When shown proof of structural integrity, they argue the reports are outdated. When given evidence that no pests are present, they claim infestations could happen at any time. They refuse to back down, because their goal isn't truth, it's removal. These false claims also serve another purpose: to isolate the narrator socially. Neighbors who once admired the barn begin to wonder if it really is a hazard. Some even confront the narrator directly, asking why they won't just tear it down for safety's sake. The HOA's lies are slowly poisoning the community, making the narrator seem unreasonable and stubborn rather than protective of family history. It becomes clear that the board is deliberately building a case to justify drastic action. By portraying the barn as unsafe, infested, and illegal, they aim to create a false sense of urgency. In reality, none of their claims hold water, but the damage is already done. Suspicion and division spread through the neighborhood, and the narrator realizes they are no longer fighting only against the HOA board, but against a narrative carefully crafted to destroy both their reputation and their barn. After weeks of receiving letters filled with threats, fines, and false accusations, the narrator finally makes their stance crystal clear: they will not comply with the HOA's demands. For the narrator, tearing down the barn is not just about removing an old structure, it's about erasing family history, destroying a legacy that has been passed down through generations. And no HOA rule, no matter how forcefully written, will convince them otherwise. When the next official violation notice arrives in the mail, demanding the immediate demolition of the barn, the narrator responds not with silence but with evidence. They send copies of structural inspection reports showing that the barn is safe and sound. They attach photos of the interior, clean and organized, disproving any claims of infestation. They even include a note reminding the board that the barn predates the HOA itself, which should exempt it from any retroactive rules. But the HOA, rather than acknowledging this, doubles down. Their next letter raises the threat of fines, escalating the amount each week until it reaches absurd figures. They warn that failure to comply could result in legal action, property liens, or even forced removal. Instead of intimidating the narrator, however, this fuels their determination. The narrator refuses to bend, writing a firm reply, "This barn is part of my family's heritage. It is safe, lawful, and maintained. I will not allow its destruction simply because you dislike how it looks." That letter becomes a symbolic turning point. It's not just resistance, it's open defiance against the HOA's misuse of power. The refusal to comply also gains attention within the community. Some neighbors, initially swayed by the HOA's lies, begin to question the board's motives. If the barn is really so dangerous, why does the owner have inspection documents proving otherwise? Why is the HOA pushing so hard for its removal when no real violation exists? Slowly, support for the narrator begins to grow. Yet, this defiance also paints a target on their back. The HOA president takes the refusal personally, escalating the hostility. At meetings, she mocks the narrator as stubborn and careless. She frames their resistance as selfish, claiming it puts the entire neighborhood at risk. But to the narrator, it's clear what's really happening. The HOA cannot tolerate someone who refuses to bow down to their authority. Despite the mounting pressure, the narrator stands firm. Their refusal isn't just about saving a building, it's about drawing a line in the sand. By saying no, they challenge the very power of the HOA, proving that homeowners do not have to live in fear of unjust rules and manipulative leaders. This act of defiance sets the stage for the HOA's most reckless move yet, taking matters into their own hands. After the narrator's refusal to comply, frustration boils within the HOA board. To them, the barn has become more than just a non-conforming structure, it's now a direct challenge to their authority. The president, angered by the homeowner's defiance, calls for a special meeting. But instead of notifying all members as required, she holds it behind closed doors, inviting only her closest allies. The meeting takes place in the HOA clubhouse, late in the evening, with a small group gathered around the table. The mood is tense. On the surface, they discuss community standards, but beneath the polite language lies a shared mission: to find a way to remove the barn, no matter the cost. The president reminds everyone that if one homeowner can openly defy the board, others might follow. To maintain control, they must make an example out of this situation. Ideas are thrown around recklessly. One board member suggests increasing fines to unbearable levels, essentially bleeding the narrator dry until compliance becomes the only option. Another proposes dragging the case into court, hoping the legal fees alone will force surrender. But the most shocking suggestion comes when the president herself raises the possibility of bypassing the homeowner altogether. She proposes that the HOA take direct action to remove the barn, claiming the bylaws give them the power to handle unsafe structures. Not everyone is fully comfortable with this idea, but the president frames it as a necessity. She paints the barn as a danger, insisting they cannot wait for a disaster to happen. Using the false claims they've been spreading, termites, structural weakness, fire hazards, she convinces the board that demolishing the barn without permission is not only justified, but a duty to protect the neighborhood. The group eventually agrees, though uneasily, and the decision is sealed. They vote in favor of emergency action, a term they know will shield them later if questioned. No notice is sent to the narrator. No chance to appeal is offered. Instead, the board quietly begins making arrangements with a demolition contractor, planning to strike when the homeowner least expects it. The secrecy of the meeting highlights just how far the HOA is willing to go to preserve its power. Rather than respecting property rights or listening to reason, they conspire in the shadows, convinced that their authority overrides individual freedoms. For them, this isn't about safety or aesthetics anymore, it's about control. Meanwhile, the narrator remains unaware of the full extent of this plotting. They know the HOA is relentless, but they still believe due process will protect them. They don't realize that a decision has already been made behind closed doors, a decision that will soon lead to the most devastating betrayal imaginable, the destruction of their historic family barn without permission. The morning of the demolition begins like any other. The narrator steps outside, perhaps ready to tend to the yard or feed the animals, when the distant rumble of heavy machinery breaks the quiet. At first, they don't think much of it, construction is common in the neighborhood, but then they notice the noise is coming from their own property. Their heart drops. Pulling closer, they see trucks, workers, and a demolition crew already on site. Without notice, without warning, the HOA has acted on the decision from their secret meeting. The narrator runs toward the barn, shouting for the workers to stop, demanding to know what's happening. But the crew is unmoved. They show a piece of paper, authorization from the HOA, claiming it gives them the right to tear down the unsafe structure. To the narrator's shock, the demolition has already begun. Within minutes, the sound of splintering wood fills the air. Beams that stood for generations crash to the ground as if they were nothing. Dust rises into the sky, coating everything in a gray haze. The narrator watches helplessly, their family's history being reduced to rubble before their eyes. They plead with the workers, they waive the inspection reports that prove the barn was safe, but the demolition crew insists they are just following orders. Neighbors gather at the edge of the property, some in disbelief, others quietly satisfied that the HOA has finally acted. Whispers ripple through the crowd, was it really unsafe? Can they do this without permission? The confusion is palpable, but by now it's too late, the destruction is well underway. For the narrator, the experience is surreal and crushing. Memories flash with every strike of the excavator, their great-grandfather building the barn by hand, family gatherings in the loft, neighbors storing hay during storms. Each plank of wood holds a story, and each one is being ripped apart. What was once a symbol of endurance and tradition is now a pile of debris. By the time the machines stop, nothing remains but rubble and dust. The barn that had stood proudly for nearly a century is gone in a matter of hours. The narrator feels a mix of rage, grief, and disbelief. They know the HOA has gone too far, this isn't enforcement, this is trespass and destruction of private property. But amidst the heartbreak, a spark of determination ignites. If the HOA thought demolishing the barn would break the narrator's spirit, they are mistaken. Instead, this act of betrayal only steels their resolve. The HOA has crossed a line that cannot be ignored. The battle is no longer about preserving a building, it's about justice, accountability, and reclaiming the power that has been so dangerously abused. The demolition sends shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. By the next day, everyone has heard about what happened. The HOA, without permission, sent in a crew and tore down a historic family barn that had stood for nearly a century. Some residents can hardly believe it, others quietly admit they saw it coming. The community, once bound by neighborly ties, is suddenly divided into two camps. On one side are those who sympathize with the narrator. They had admired the barn as part of the neighborhood's character, even if they didn't say it out loud before. To them, the HOA's actions seem extreme and unlawful. These neighbors whisper about how wrong it was to act without a court order, and some begin questioning what the HOA might do next. If they could demolish a barn without permission, what would stop them from targeting sheds, fences, or even someone's house extensions? Fear begins to ripple through this group, but so does solidarity. They approach the narrator quietly, offering words of support and even suggesting that the HOA should be held accountable. On the other side are residents who side with the HOA. Whether out of fear of fines, loyalty to the board, or genuine belief in community standards, they defend the demolition. They argue that the barn was an eyesore, that it lowered property values, or that it might have been unsafe. Some of them even claim the HOA was brave to act when the homeowner refused to comply. These individuals repeat the false claims the board has been spreading: termites, fire hazards, collapsing beams, despite never seeing evidence themselves. For them, the HOA's action is not vandalism but enforcement. This division begins to show in everyday life. Where once neighbors waved and chatted at mailboxes, now conversations are cut short. Some turn their backs when the narrator walks by, while others make a point of stopping to say, "We're with you." The neighborhood feels colder, tense, and split down the middle. For the narrator, this division is painful but also revealing. It exposes who genuinely values fairness and who blindly follows authority. It also highlights the true danger of unchecked HOA power, not just the physical destruction of property, but the tearing apart of a community's social fabric. Rumors spread quickly. Some claim the narrator exaggerated the barn's importance, while others insist the HOA broke multiple laws. The story becomes a heated topic at every gathering, from backyard barbecues to school drop-offs. What once was a peaceful community now feels like a battlefield of opinions. The narrator realizes that the fight is no longer theirs alone. The barn's destruction has awakened something bigger, a community reckoning. People are beginning to ask hard questions about the board's leadership, its motives, and whether it truly represents the interests of the homeowners, or simply enforces the will of a few power-hungry individuals. In the days following the barn's demolition, the narrator's grief slowly transforms into determination. Shock and sadness give way to a burning question: how could the HOA get away with this? To find the answer, the narrator begins a personal investigation, determined to uncover the truth about the board's actions and expose their misconduct. The first step is paperwork. The narrator digs through their files, gathering every HOA notice, violation letter, and demand they had received. Side by side, the documents reveal a pattern: vague language, inconsistent citations, and references to unsafe conditions, with no proof attached. More importantly, the narrator notices that none of the notices ever mentioned an official inspection or gave a legal right of entry. The HOA had claimed authority they never actually possessed. Next, the narrator turns to the community bylaws. Late into the night, they flip through the dense legal language, highlighting key sections. To their surprise, nowhere does it grant the HOA power to demolish a homeowner's structure without consent or a court order. At most, the bylaws allow for fines and liens, not trespassing and destruction. This discovery strengthens their resolve. The HOA acted far outside its legal limits, and the evidence is on paper. But paperwork alone isn't enough. The narrator also seeks witnesses. They begin speaking with neighbors who were present during the demolition. Some admit they were stunned by what they saw and confirm that the narrator was never given proper notice. Others recall hearing the HOA president bragging about taking care of the problem once and for all, before the bulldozers arrived. These testimonies reveal not just misconduct but premeditation. The narrator also looks into the demolition crew. A quick inquiry reveals that the contractor was hired directly by the HOA under the justification of an emergency order. But when pressed, the company admits they never saw proof of danger. They were simply shown a letter with the HOA's seal and told to proceed. That admission is powerful. It shows the board misled even the contractors. Piece by piece, the narrator begins to build a case. What started as suspicion is turning into clear evidence of abuse of power, trespass, property destruction, and potentially even fraud. The more they uncover, the more the community begins to rally behind them. Some neighbors who had once defended the HOA now question their loyalty, realizing they may have been deceived. The investigation also reveals something deeper: the demolition was not about safety at all. Buried in meeting notes and whispered conversations, the narrator learns of redevelopment plans, a proposal to use their land as leverage for new neighborhood projects. The barn wasn't demolished for the community's good, it was destroyed because it stood in the way of the board's ambitions. As the narrator digs deeper, the investigation takes a darker turn. What began as a search for answers about the barn's unlawful demolition slowly unravels into something far bigger, a pattern of corruption running through the HOA board itself. The first piece of evidence comes from financial records. After filing a request to review the HOA's budgets, a right guaranteed to all homeowners, the narrator notices glaring inconsistencies. Thousands of dollars have been withdrawn under vague labels like community improvements and safety projects. Yet, when compared to actual work done in the neighborhood, there's little to show for it. The demolition itself, for instance, was listed under emergency safety repairs, even though the barn was never inspected or proven unsafe. This financial sleight of hand is the first clear sign of foul play. Digging further, the narrator discovers that the demolition contractor is not just a random company. One of the board members has a cousin who works there, and the contract was awarded without bids or community approval. This suggests more than negligence, it hints at nepotism and possible financial kickbacks. The realization stings: the barn wasn't just destroyed recklessly, it may have been sacrificed for profit. More cracks in the facade appear as the narrator interviews neighbors who once supported the HOA. One recalls overhearing the president boasting about using the barn money to cover other expenses. Another remembers a suspiciously rushed vote on landscaping upgrades that never materialized. Bit by bit, a picture emerges of a board using its authority not to serve the community, but to enrich itself and tighten control. The narrator also gains access to internal HOA emails, leaked by a sympathetic board member who has grown uncomfortable with the deceit. In these messages, the president refers to the barn as leverage for redevelopment plans, and dismisses concerns about legality with lines like, "By the time they fight it, it'll be too late." These words confirm what the narrator feared all along: the demolition wasn't about safety, but about clearing obstacles for future projects, and silencing defiance. As this evidence piles up, the narrator begins organizing it into a structured case: financial misconduct, abuse of authority, conflict of interest, and deliberate deception. The corruption isn't just about one barn, it's systemic, woven into how the HOA operates. And now, with proof in hand, the narrator knows the board can no longer hide behind polished speeches and intimidating fines. What once seemed like a hopeless loss begins to feel like an opportunity. Exposing this corruption could not only deliver justice for the destroyed barn, but also free the entire community from years of fear and manipulation. The narrator realizes they are no longer just fighting for personal justice, they are leading a movement to take down a corrupt system. By the time the narrator uncovers the corruption, their course of action becomes clear: the HOA cannot be allowed to get away with its crimes. Gathering the paperwork, financial records, witness statements, and leaked emails, the narrator prepares to take the fight into the legal arena. The demolition of the barn is no longer just a personal tragedy, it is a clear case of property destruction, abuse of power, and fraud. The first step is finding the right attorney. After consulting with several, the narrator hires a lawyer experienced in HOA disputes and property rights. When the attorney hears the full story and reviews the evidence, they are stunned. "This isn't just overreach," the lawyer remarks, "this is a slam-dunk case of illegal activity." With professional support, the narrator feels more confident than ever. The legal team begins drafting the lawsuit, which includes multiple charges: unlawful trespass, destruction of private property, breach of contract, and mismanagement of HOA funds. They also prepare claims for emotional distress and punitive damages, knowing the board's reckless behavior has caused deep harm. Each piece of evidence is carefully catalogued: photographs of the demolished barn, financial records showing suspicious expenditures, and the damning emails where the board president openly mocked the homeowners' rights. When the lawsuit is officially filed in court, the ripple effect across the community is immediate. Word spreads quickly, and neighbors whisper in awe, "Someone's finally standing up to them." For years, many had complained quietly about the HOA's arrogance but were too afraid to challenge it. Now, the narrator has broken that silence. The HOA board, however, does not take it lightly. They respond with threats of counter-lawsuits, fines, and smear campaigns, trying to paint the narrator as a disruptive homeowner. Flyers are slipped into mailboxes claiming the lawsuit will bankrupt the neighborhood, and that the narrator is acting out of selfishness. But this time, the scare tactics don't work. Too many residents have already seen the truth, and the lawsuit gives them hope that justice is possible. The filing also catches the attention of local media. A small-town newspaper picks up the story of a historic barn being demolished without permission, and soon reporters are calling for interviews. The HOA, once smug and untouchable, suddenly finds itself in the spotlight, its actions questioned by people far beyond the neighborhood. For the narrator, the lawsuit is more than legal paperwork, it is a declaration of war against corruption. Every court date, every filing, every press question brings them closer to holding the board accountable. The barn may be gone, but its memory fuels the fight. And deep down, the narrator knows this lawsuit is not just about reclaiming what was lost, it's about ensuring that no HOA ever again abuses its power so recklessly. Once the lawsuit is filed, the HOA board realizes their authority is in serious jeopardy. For years, they had ruled unchecked, enforcing fines and rules with little resistance. But now, faced with legal action and public scrutiny, they are forced to shift into defense mode. And rather than admit wrongdoing, they double down. The first move is intimidation. The board begins issuing a barrage of violation notices to the narrator, claims about lawn length, mailbox color, and even parking too close to the curb. Each notice comes with threats of fines, as if to overwhelm the narrator with petty harassment. It is a transparent attempt to wear them down emotionally and financially. But the narrator, backed by their attorney, documents every notice as further evidence of retaliation. Next, the HOA launches a smear campaign. Flyers are circulated in the neighborhood accusing the narrator of costing homeowners thousands in legal fees. At board meetings, the president insists the lawsuit is an attack on the entire community, not just the board. They frame the narrator as selfish and disruptive, twisting the story to cast themselves as protectors of property values. Unfortunately for them, many residents have already seen enough corruption to doubt their words. The board also tries to manipulate public opinion by exaggerating costs. They send out notices claiming HOA dues may rise to cover legal defense, deliberately trying to turn neighbors against the narrator. Some residents grow nervous, but others see it as yet another scare tactic. Tension in the neighborhood rises. Conversations at the mailbox become heated debates about loyalty, justice, and fairness. Behind the scenes, the HOA's lawyer files counterclaims. They accuse the narrator of defamation and interfering with board operations. These counterattacks are designed not to win but to delay, dragging out the process in hopes the narrator will give up. But the narrator's attorney dismantles these claims one by one, pointing out the lack of evidence and the board's history of unlawful behavior. Still, the HOA is relentless. At meetings, the president bangs the gavel, silencing homeowners who dare to ask questions. Neighbors who voice support for the narrator find themselves quietly targeted too, receiving surprise violation notices or facing pressure to withdraw from committees. It becomes clear the board is fighting for more than the lawsuit, they are fighting to maintain their control. But their desperation shows cracks. Every retaliatory notice, every dishonest flyer, every silenced homeowner only proves the narrator's case further. Instead of weakening the fight, the HOA's aggressive tactics strengthen it. More neighbors begin to see the truth. This is not about one barn or one homeowner, but about a board that has grown drunk with power. After weeks of relentless retaliation from the HOA, the narrator feels the pressure but refuses to back down. What the board fails to realize is that their aggression is no longer intimidating, it's unraveling their authority piece by piece. The lawsuit, the mounting evidence, and the board's over-the-top response all combine to shift momentum. For the first time, the narrator senses the tide turning in their favor. The change begins with the community itself. Neighbors who once remained silent start stepping forward. One family, tired of constant HOA harassment, approaches the narrator and shares their own story of being fined for trivial violations, like having the wrong shade of curtains. Another admits they were pressured into voting a certain way during a past board election. These personal accounts paint a broader picture of systemic abuse. With more homeowners speaking out, the narrator realizes they are no longer fighting alone. Public opinion also swings as local media continues covering the case. A small news station interviews the narrator, who calmly explains how their family's historic barn was bulldozed without consent. The footage of the empty lot contrasted with old family photos strikes an emotional chord. The HOA president, on the other hand, appears defensive and evasive in interviews, dodging questions about financial discrepancies. Viewers quickly recognize who is telling the truth. Meanwhile, the courtroom battles bring more victories. The judge allows the lawsuit to proceed despite the HOA's attempts to dismiss it. The narrator's attorney also manages to subpoena HOA financial records, which reveal further misuse of funds, lavish dinners, unnecessary consulting fees, and contracts awarded to friends and relatives. Each revelation weakens the board's credibility. The narrator also finds strength in organization. With the help of supportive neighbors, they begin hosting informal community gatherings, small backyard meetings where homeowners can speak freely without fear of board retaliation. These gatherings spark a grassroots movement, talk of replacing the board entirely. For the first time, the community feels hopeful that real change is possible. Even the HOA's tactics begin to backfire. The endless violation notices and smear campaigns now look less like authority and more like desperation. Neighbors laugh at the absurdity of the charges: too many flowers, holiday lights left up 2 days too long. Instead of isolating the narrator, the harassment builds sympathy and solidarity. By the time the next HOA meeting arrives, the atmosphere has completely shifted. Dozens of residents pack the room, not to support the board, but to challenge it. Questions fly about missing funds, shady contracts, and the unlawful demolition. For the first time, the board is on the defensive. The president's gavel can no longer silence a community that has found its voice. The shift in momentum leads to something powerful. Neighbors who once stood divided or silent now find themselves coming together with a shared purpose. The wrongful demolition of the barn and the board's heavy-handed retaliation have sparked outrage, but more importantly, they have built a sense of unity among residents who realize they've all been victims of the same corruption. It starts small. A few families, inspired by the narrator's courage, begin meeting regularly to discuss their own grievances with the HOA. They discover troubling similarities: fines for minor landscaping choices, threats of liens for late dues, and intimidation when they questioned board decisions. What once felt like isolated struggles now looks like a deliberate pattern of abuse. Sharing these stories bonds the neighbors together. From there, the movement gains structure. The narrator suggests forming a homeowners coalition, an independent group focused on accountability and transparency. Within days, dozens sign up. Some bring professional skills. One is an accountant who volunteers to analyze financial reports, another is a graphic designer who creates flyers to spread awareness. Retired residents contribute their time, while younger families provide energy and enthusiasm. The coalition transforms frustration into organized action. Soon, the HOA meetings are no longer quiet affairs controlled by the board. Instead, residents attend en masse, armed with questions, documentation, and support for one another. Where once the president could silence dissent with intimidation, now voices rise in chorus demanding answers. The board, once untouchable, looks visibly rattled. Outside the meetings, the coalition takes the message directly to the community. They set up neighborhood petitions, calling for new elections and stricter oversight of board finances. Yard signs appear reading, "Take back our HOA," and "Accountability now." Social media groups spring up where residents freely share information without fear of censorship. The coalition becomes a force too strong for the board to ignore. Even those who initially supported the HOA begin changing sides. The evidence of financial mismanagement, combined with stories of harassment, makes it clear the board no longer represents the interests of the community. As one neighbor puts it, if it could happen to their barn, it could happen to any of us. That realization cements solidarity. The narrator, once targeted and isolated, now stands at the center of a united community. Instead of a lone battle, this has become a collective movement. Together, they are not just fighting for justice over one demolished barn, they are fighting to reclaim their neighborhood from corruption. This unity marks a turning point. The HOA may have power on paper, but the community has something stronger: numbers, truth, and determination. And when neighbors stand shoulder to shoulder, the board's authority begins to crumble. With the community united, the next logical step is to take back control of the HOA through the ballot box. The narrator and their coalition realize that lawsuits alone won't guarantee lasting change. If the corrupt board stays in power, they'll continue abusing their authority. The upcoming HOA election becomes the community's chance to reclaim leadership, and this time, the narrator is ready to run a full campaign. The coalition organizes quickly. They nominate a slate of candidates, including the narrator, who has become a symbol of resistance and integrity. Other nominees include neighbors known for fairness, honesty, and community service. Together, they represent an alternative to the current board's arrogance and secrecy. The campaign's message is clear: transparency, accountability, respect for homeowners. Door-to-door efforts begin. The narrator and volunteers visit every household, listening to concerns and sharing plans for change. Many neighbors are shocked to learn the full extent of the board's financial mismanagement. Some who were hesitant before now pledge support after seeing the evidence firsthand. Flyers and newsletters highlight the wasteful spending, the unlawful demolition, and the endless cycle of harassment. The coalition also leverages modern tools. A neighborhood social media page becomes a hub for updates, rally announcements, and Q&A sessions. Videos are shared showing the narrator speaking passionately about preserving the community's values and protecting homeowners' rights. These posts reach even those who rarely attend meetings, ensuring no voice is left unheard. Meanwhile, the old board doesn't go down without a fight. The president and loyalists run their own smear campaign, calling the coalition radicals who want to destroy the neighborhood. They warn that electing inexperienced candidates will lower property values. But these tired scare tactics fail to stick. Too many residents have lived through the board's corruption to believe their words anymore. Community meetings leading up to the vote feel more like political rallies. The coalition speaks confidently about reducing unnecessary fines, ensuring fair treatment, and protecting homeowner rights. The narrator, once dismissed as just another problem homeowner, now commands the room with calm authority. Each speech reminds the crowd why this fight matters, not just for one barn, but for the soul of their neighborhood. As election day approaches, excitement grows. Neighbors who once avoided HOA politics now line up to cast ballots, determined to see change. The board senses their grip slipping, scrambling to rally last-minute support, but it is too late. The tide has turned too strongly against them. The election is no longer just about board seats, it's about choosing between corruption and community. And for the first time in years, the people feel hopeful that justice and fairness are within reach. Election day arrives with a sense of anticipation that the neighborhood hasn't felt in years. Usually, HOA elections are dull affairs with low turnout, but this one feels different, charged with energy, almost like a local festival. Neighbors who rarely participated now show up determined to make their voices heard. For many, it isn't just about casting a ballot, it's about reclaiming their community from the grip of corruption. The meeting hall is packed to capacity. Folding chairs are pulled out to accommodate the unexpected crowd, and a line of residents stretches out the door, waiting to register their votes. The atmosphere is tense but hopeful, with quiet conversations about the barn, the lawsuit, and the future of the neighborhood. The narrator, standing alongside the other coalition candidates, feels the weight of the moment but also the strength of solidarity. This is no longer a lone battle, but a united movement. The current board, visibly rattled, tries to maintain control of the proceedings. The president gives a long, defensive speech about protecting property values and keeping the community safe. But the words fall flat. Too many people know the truth now, about the financial mismanagement, the secret deals, and the unlawful demolition. When the narrator speaks, the contrast is striking. Instead of fear, their message is one of hope, fairness, and accountability. The crowd responds with nods, applause, and a renewed sense of trust. As ballots are cast, the tension builds. Volunteers from both sides help count under watchful eyes to ensure fairness. The old board looks grim, whispering among themselves, while coalition members stand confidently, ready for whatever outcome comes. Finally, the results are announced. The narrator and every member of the coalition have won by a decisive margin. The room erupts in cheers, neighbors hugging, clapping, and even shedding tears. Years of frustration and silence suddenly lift, replaced by a sense of victory and empowerment. The corrupt board members, once feared and untouchable, are left stunned, their power stripped away by the very people they thought they controlled. For the narrator, the win is deeply personal. It isn't just about gaining a board seat, it's about justice for the barn, for their family's heritage, and for every neighbor who suffered under the old regime. But it's also bigger than that, it represents the triumph of community over tyranny. The celebration that follows feels like a turning point. Neighbors who once avoided each other now gather in small groups, smiling and talking about the future. The coalition pledges to make good on their promises, transparent finances, fair treatment, and respect for homeowners' voices. Victory at the polls proves one truth beyond doubt: when people unite, even the most powerful board can be brought down. With the coalition's sweeping victory at the polls, the new board wastes no time turning its promises into action. One of their first priorities is to expose everything the old board tried to hide. The narrator, now sitting as a newly elected member, knows that sunlight is the best disinfectant. If the community is ever going to heal, the truth must be revealed, fully, openly, and without sugarcoating. The process begins with a full audit of the HOA's financial records. The coalition hires an independent accountant, who combs through years of budgets, invoices, and receipts. What they find confirms the worst suspicions: thousands of dollars spent on consulting services linked to friends of the old president, unexplained cash withdrawals, and inflated payments to the demolition contractor who tore down the barn. The numbers tell a story of systematic abuse of homeowners' dues. But it's not just the money. Old emails, uncovered through legal discovery and whistleblowers, show how the former board manipulated votes, bullied dissenters, and orchestrated the barn demolition under the false pretense of emergency safety concerns. These communications reveal a pattern of deceit, proof that the demolition was not about protecting the community, but about clearing land for a redevelopment plan that would have personally benefited board members. Once the findings are compiled, the new board calls a special community meeting. Residents fill the hall once again, eager to hear what has been uncovered. This time, however, the mood is different. Instead of fear or anger, there is anticipation. Neighbors know the truth is finally coming to light. The narrator presents the evidence methodically: the financial records, the incriminating emails, and the testimony of contractors who admitted they were misled. Each revelation sparks murmurs, gasps, and even outright outrage from the crowd. For years, residents suspected corruption but had no proof. Now, it is laid bare before them, undeniable and documented. The old board members, sitting in the back, shrink under the weight of public shame. Some try to defend themselves, but their excuses fall flat. One neighbor bluntly asks, "How could you destroy history for your own gain?" The silence that follows speaks louder than any answer could. By the end of the meeting, the community is unified not just by anger but by relief. At last, the lies are exposed, the truth acknowledged, and accountability demanded. The new board promises to forward the findings to law enforcement and pursue restitution for the stolen funds. For the narrator, this moment is bittersweet. The barn is gone and cannot be replaced, but its destruction has uncovered a deeper rot, and in exposing it, they've given their community the chance to start over stronger, wiser, and free from corruption. The truth is out, but exposing corruption is only the beginning. For the narrator and the new HOA board, real justice means holding the former leaders accountable in ways that carry lasting consequences. No longer can the old board hide behind closed meetings or legal jargon. Now, their actions face the weight of the law. The first step comes when the coalition turns over the audit findings and incriminating emails to the county authorities. Investigators take the evidence seriously, opening a formal inquiry into fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. What once seemed like just neighborhood politics now escalates into potential criminal charges. The community watches with anticipation as detectives interview witnesses, subpoena financial records, and piece together the extent of the old board's misconduct. Meanwhile, the lawsuit filed earlier by the narrator begins to move forward with new strength. With the revelations of fraud and misuse of funds, the case against the former board becomes airtight. The HOA's insurance company, facing undeniable liability, pressures for a settlement. Eventually, the court rules in favor of the narrator, awarding damages for the unlawful demolition of the barn and emotional distress. The financial compensation cannot replace the lost family structure, but it is a public acknowledgement that the board acted illegally. For the former president and her allies, the consequences are harsh. Several are forced to step down from community committees, and their reputations crumble. Local media picks up the story, publishing headlines like HOA board exposed in corruption scandal and barn demolition sparks criminal investigation. Neighbors who once admired or feared these individuals now turn away in disgust. Justice isn't only about punishment, though. The new board takes symbolic steps to restore trust. They pass new bylaws requiring full transparency of all finances, open access to meeting minutes, and mandatory community votes for major decisions. What once was an unchecked system of power is now rebuilt into a structure of accountability. The narrator also ensures the barn's memory is honored. With part of the settlement money, a small memorial park is created on the site, featuring a plaque that reads, "In memory of our community's history and the strength that comes from standing together." The space becomes a gathering spot for neighbors, turning what was once a symbol of loss into a reminder of resilience and justice achieved. For the narrator, seeing the corrupt board face consequences brings closure. The barn is gone, but its story changed the neighborhood forever. What started as a lonely fight against powerful bullies ended in victory, accountability, and reform. Justice, once uncertain, is finally served. With justice served and the corrupt board finally out of power, the hardest part begins, not in the courtroom or the meeting hall, but in the day-to-day lives of the neighbors who must learn how to trust one another again. The HOA, once a source of division and fear, needs to become what it was always meant to be, a tool for maintaining harmony, fairness, and community pride. The narrator and the newly elected board focus first on healing the wounds left by years of intimidation. They organize open forums where residents are encouraged to voice their grievances, not just about the barn but about all the small injustices they endured, unfair fines, ignored requests, or bullying letters. For many, it's the first time they feel truly heard. Listening sessions turn into community conversations, giving neighbors a sense of ownership and inclusion that was long missing. Transparency becomes the cornerstone of the new HOA's operations. Monthly financial reports are published and distributed, meetings are streamed online for anyone who can't attend, and major proposals are voted on by the entire membership instead of a small board clique. These simple steps, though procedural, carry enormous symbolic weight. They send a message: this board serves the people, not itself. The narrator also pushes for initiatives designed to bring people together outside of politics. A neighborhood barbecue is held on the site of the demolished barn, now transformed into a small memorial park. Families bring food, children play, and conversations flow easily across fences that once divided households. For the first time in years, the community feels like a family instead of a battlefield. To rebuild trust further, the new board reviews old fines and violations issued by the previous regime. Many homeowners are refunded money unfairly collected, and invalid violations are officially cleared from records. This act of fairness helps erase bitterness and restores goodwill, showing that justice is not just about punishing the guilty but also about repairing harm. Neighbors who once avoided each other due to the toxic environment slowly reconnect. People begin volunteering for committees, offering skills in gardening, event planning, or safety patrols. What was once a climate of fear is replaced with collaboration and participation. The HOA evolves from a source of resentment into a true representation of community spirit. For the narrator, rebuilding trust is the most rewarding chapter of the entire battle. Though the barn itself is gone, its memory has become a catalyst for unity. By exposing corruption and then working tirelessly to heal the wounds, the narrator proves that strength lies not only in fighting back but also in lifting others up. In the end, the community doesn't just rebuild trust, it builds something stronger, a foundation of shared respect and collective resilience that no corrupt board can ever shatter again. After months of conflict, exposure, and healing, the community finally stands on the threshold of something entirely new. What began as a bitter fight over a single historic barn has transformed into the foundation for a healthier, stronger, and more united neighborhood. For the narrator, this moment feels like the closing of one chapter and the hopeful opening of another. The most visible sign of this new beginning is the memorial park built where the barn once stood. Though the physical structure is gone, the space has been reshaped into a gathering place with benches, flower beds, and a plaque honoring the barn's legacy. Families walk their dogs, children play tag, and neighbors sit together to share coffee. The site that once symbolized destruction now radiates renewal, proof that loss can give way to something meaningful. The new board uses this momentum to reimagine the HOA's role. Instead of dictating rules from above, they focus on service, organizing volunteer days to help elderly residents with yard work, coordinating safety watches, and hosting seasonal events like holiday markets and summer picnics. Participation is no longer an obligation but a joy. Attendance at meetings rises not because of fear, but because people want their voices heard. The narrator reflects on the personal transformation, too. At the start, they were just one person against a powerful board, filled with frustration and grief over their family's heritage. But through the struggle, they found allies, built a coalition, and became a leader in their community. What once felt like an impossible burden has turned into a source of pride and purpose. Neighbors who once distrusted one another now cooperate, their shared battle against corruption forging bonds that will last for years. Fences that divided homes seem less like barriers and more like connections. The scars left by the old HOA still linger, but instead of bitterness, they serve as reminders of how far the community has come. The phrase, "new beginning," doesn't just mean new leadership, it means a new spirit. The community now has systems in place to prevent abuse, but more importantly, it has rediscovered its humanity. People wave when they pass each other, check in on those who need help, and take genuine pride in their shared neighborhood. For the narrator, this new beginning is bittersweet but fulfilling. The barn is gone, yet its memory sparked the fight that reshaped everything. Out of injustice came empowerment, and out of loss came renewal. The community has not only reclaimed control, it has reclaimed its soul. This is not the end of the story, but the start of a brighter one, built on unity, resilience, and hope. Although the barn itself no longer stands, its spirit continues to live on in the hearts of the narrator and the community. What was once just a family structure has become a symbol of resistance, resilience, and rebirth. Its legacy stretches far beyond wood and nails, it now represents the strength of people who refuse to be silenced by corruption. The barn's demolition was initially a story of tragedy. Built by the narrator's great-grandfather, it carried nearly a century of history. Its destruction felt like an erasure of identity, a wound that could not be healed. Yet, in the wake of that loss, the barn became something larger, the rallying point for a neighborhood tired of being controlled by fear and deceit. What the HOA meant to erase instead gave rise to the strongest movement the community had ever seen. The memorial park, established on the barn's old foundation, ensures that the story is never forgotten. A bronze plaque tells visitors about the barn's history and the fight that followed its unlawful demolition. School children on field trips stop to read it, and neighbors often bring their families to explain what happened, how a simple building became the catalyst for justice and reform. In this way, the barn continues teaching lessons even in its absence. For the narrator, the legacy is deeply personal. The barn was more than a building, it was a reminder of their family's roots and sacrifices. By standing up for it, even when it was ultimately destroyed, they honored their ancestors. The victory against the corrupt HOA, coupled with the unity that followed, becomes a tribute not only to the barn but also to the values it stood for: hard work, fairness, and perseverance. The community carries the legacy forward through action. Annual Barn Day celebrations are held in the park, where neighbors gather to share food, music, and stories about resilience. Funds are raised for local charities, reinforcing the spirit of giving back. The HOA, now reformed, operates under the guiding principle that never again will one group abuse its power unchecked. In time, the barn's story spreads beyond the neighborhood. Local newspapers and even regional outlets report on how one community toppled corruption and rebuilt stronger. The tale inspires other HOA communities facing similar struggles, proving that ordinary people, when united, can take back control from those who misuse authority. The barn may be gone, but its legacy endures as a powerful reminder that even in loss, something greater can be built. It taught a community how to stand together, how to fight for what matters, and how to transform tragedy into triumph. In the end, the barn's true legacy is not its destruction, but the unity and justice it left behind.